What you see on the screen is a video of a human brain being recorded with magnetic resonance imaging equipment. Many of you may already know this, but this technology has been enabling clinics and hospitals around the world to diagnose and begin early intervention treatment for serious diseases such as cancer. Undoubtedly, it could be said that discovery of this type of machine, which allows doctors to observe the inside of our bodies with defined images, was a turning point in the world of medicine. But most interestingly of all, the technology used in today's MRI equipment was not actually invented for the world of medicine, but was invented for a very different purpose, for the world of warfare. If there is one thing we can all agree on, it's that wars are an unmitigated disaster. They are cruel, barbaric, unjust, calamitous situations that no human being should ever have to go through. However, with that said, as terrible as wars can be, the truth is that thanks to them, we now have a multitude of technologies and scientific advances that might not exist without them. The case of magnetic resonance imaging is a clear example of that, but beyond that, wherever we look, we are sure to find a multitude of goods and services that arose precisely because of the threat of war. For example, think of the GPS in your phone, the light bulbs that are often produced by nuclear energy, invented for war purposes, or even the internet itself. The first internet network in history was known as ARPANET, a network developed by the US Department of Defense, whose infrastructure you are looking at right now on your screen. All of this is something that has made us ask ourselves a few questions here on Visualeconomik. Is it possible that war, beyond its terrible consequences, can also be a catalyst for innovation and technological development? Are all of these inventions just a coincidence, or is there something much more important behind war economies? In addition, could countries currently at war, like Ukraine, end up becoming new technological powerhouses in a few decades? Is the US today so advanced thanks to the innovations brought about by all the wars, hot and cold, in which it has participated? Pretty interesting, right? So let's find out. The year is 1957. What you are seeing on screen are images of the first artificial satellite that the USA tried to launch into space, the Vanguard TV-3. Tens of thousands of people were able to see, thanks to their television sets, how American scientists were about to achieve one of the greatest things ever done by mankind. Or at least, they could see how they tried to do it. The launch of the Vanguard TV-3 was a complete and total failure. It was not only a failure at the scientific level, but also at the political and even military level. You see, just a few months before the Vanguard disaster, the Soviet Union had managed to get ahead of the United States by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite in history to reach Earth's orbit. The thing is, you probably can't imagine what a blow this was to American society. The Soviets, the communists, the Reds, the fathers of the revolution, the ultimate enemy of the United States, they were winning the space race, and therefore also the Cold War. At the time, no one knew how space could be used as an extension of the battlefield, even at the nuclear level, and according to various reports at the time, this was a danger that really frightened American society. The US government was forced to respond. Until then, space missions had not been considered a very important matter. They were just another branch of the Defense Department. They had neither an entity of their own, nor enough budget to catch up with their main rival. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was a communist country that was capable of devoting all the resources of its economy to one singular goal. If the US wanted to overcome the enormous Russian machine, it would have to pull out all the stops. That is why, in 1958, the most important space organization we have known to date was created, NASA. I don't think I need to tell you, but the creation of NASA was a resounding success, not just for America, but also for my t-shirt collection. The US went from not even being able to launch a small satellite to, 10 years later, sending 4 men to the moon and bringing them back home safely. This was achieved through an enormous amount of public spending. The US government spent more than 0.7% of its GDP on NASA development alone, a figure even higher than what many countries spend on their entire militaries. Thanks to all this investment, NASA not only achieved a sweeping victory over the Soviet Union, it also developed a multitude of technologies such as digital imaging to map the moon, which years later was vital for the use of the MRIs we talked about at the beginning of this video. However, the most interesting and important part of all this, the reason why we are making this video on an economics channel and not on, for example, an astronomy channel, lies in the following map. This map shows the US counties where the space industry was active during the space race era. NASA invested most of its resources in the more obscure counties. The kicker is that a recent study looked at what happened to those economies of those counties, and what it found was this. During the space race, the counties that received NASA investments boosted their production levels. Patents galore were created, wages rose, and unemployment levels even dropped. Up to this point, everything was expected. Now, the curious thing, though, about what happened with this matter was what happened when the space race ended. That is, when NASA stopped spending money in these areas. What What would have been expected was that when the huge injections of public money were lost, the economy of these places would have collapsed. However, the opposite happened. The places where NASA spent all its money continued to prosper, even long after running out of government money. This study calculates that for every euro invested, the economy managed to grow by about 3.8 additional euros, in addition to achieving social rates of return of about 20% per year. And I'm sure after hearing this, many of you are asking yourselves one question. Is this proof that public spending is the key to triggering an economy? Can this type of war investment be applied to other types of industries or countries to turn them into technological giants? Well, pay close attention, because what we're about to tell you should not be missed.
How it is spent, not how much is spent.
Well, let's be clear about one thing. NASA spending, and in general, the spending of any military investment and development in the United States, has been a very different kind of public spending than conventional public spending. For example, let's go back to the graph of NASA investments. Although while public spending on the space race came from the public coffers, the vast majority was invested directly in private companies in the aeronautics and technology sectors. For the most part, the space race was not carried out by civil servants or scientists in universities. It was carried out by subcontracted companies. More than 90% of the workers dedicated to NASA were employed by private companies. This might seem like a minor, almost insignificant point, but it actually makes a huge difference for two main reasons. The first is that by devoting public spending to private companies, the innumerable problems that public companies tend to have are avoided. By that we mean things like huge bureaucracies, the lack of knowledge in the precise sector, political incentive problems, regulatory rigidities, and a host of other problems. But the second reason is because it is an excellent opportunity to trigger the development and creation of local industries, especially where there are budding industries with a great future projection, such as in the aerospace sector that was at the time. Be that as it may, beyond channeling investment through private companies, there is another big reason why investments are very different compared to other regular government spending. These types of investments linked to national security or military superiority are usually directed to innovative industries, research and development of cutting-edge technologies with applied results. Later, all these scientific and technological discoveries can be used in other branches of the economy, as we saw, for example, with MRIs at the start of this video. Let's just say that there are not one-time investments, but they contribute over the long term. In addition, the sectors in which investments are made tend to be manufacturing sectors, which in turn need other companies to support them with materials, product parts, or other essential supplies for their work to continue. This leads to these types of public investments creating huge knock-on effects that multiply the benefits on the economy. These types of investments ended up being more than twice as effective as other public spending policies in the country. However, everything we have just explained does not help us to answer one essential question that still remains. Why is it that when the space race was over, the counties that no longer received all the money continued to get richer and richer? What exactly is it that causes a region to become cutting edge and self-sufficient after a huge wave of investment without the need for more public money? Well, the answer to that question lies in the aircraft factories of World War II. Check this out.
Push and go.
When the Second World War broke out, the US became the largest supplier of arms and munitions to Allied countries, and one of those weapons was, precisely, fighter planes. During the early years, aircraft factories accumulated workers, machines, and assembly plants to produce as many aircraft as physically possible. However, at the height of the war, the US government demanded so many aircraft from their factories that they simply could not keep up. There were no longer enough workers, no more machines to accumulate. The system was completely saturated. The economy ran out of resources, and the factories were running out of steam. The logical thing, perhaps, would have been that in this situation, aircraft production would have been completely stagnant or even reduced. However, this is not what actually happened. Despite running out of workers, despite no longer having enough machines, the factories managed to more than triple their aircraft production. And do you want to know how they did it? Of course you do. They did it by imitating the model of the automobile industry, adopting assembly line production, improving working conditions to reduce absenteeism, and standardizing production. This is something that seems quite logical. I mean, Henry Ford invented assembly lines many years before World War II, and it makes perfect sense the aircraft industry would follow in his example. But it wasn't until the Second World War came along that it did. That is, until 30 years after Ford did it. So the question is, why did it take them so long? The answer is summarized best in this following quote.
In peacetime, the aircraft industry has had no opportunity to acquire familiarity with line production techniques. These techniques were not needed to meet peacetime production demands and were not used because of their high cost at peacetime volumes of output. Lilly et al., 1955.
The bottom line is that the enormous demand caused by the war forced the companies that were struggling to adapt. This would explain why, years later, the effects of NASA's huge investment were able to extend over time and end up improving entire industries in the long term. What was done with those investments was to force the productive adaptation of a multitude of companies. They were put on the ropes in order to boost their productivity. The truth is that right now, this is something that is very close to our hearts. I mean, since the war in Ukraine and the pandemic, the world has experienced shortages in thousands and thousands of products, particularly technological products such as microchips. Many companies have been overwhelmed and stretched thin over the last few years. But as we have seen, it is quite possible that because of that, they have had to become more productive. And perhaps in the long run, they may be able to provide us with more, better, and cheaper products. You know, sometimes you just need a push to get started. Be that as it may, there is another reason that could explain the long-term success of wars and this type of investment in a country's industries. I mean, does the Manhattan Project ring a bell? For those of you who might not know, the Manhattan Project was the US government program tasked with developing and creating the world's first nuclear fission bomb. This macro project was part of a much larger package of measures that the US launched with the aim of creating new weapons and technologies with which to win World War II. Thanks to this program, numerous patents and inventions were created, such as radar technology, sonar, and of course, in the end, the atomic bomb itself. The point is that a study analysed the evolution of patents in the regions where these projects were carried out, and it found out the following. Regions where scientific projects such as the Manhattan Project were underway created up to 40% more patents over the following decades than the rest of the US regions. Once again, it was the initial investment that gave a huge push to the whole industry that allowed it to then fly by itself. And how was this achieved, you might ask? The answer given by researchers is that it was thanks to the concentration and talent of companies. Public investment functioned as a kind of geographic organizer. The most cutting-edge companies, the best scientists and engineers were concentrated in the regions where the government initiated these projects. Once they all came together, it was only a matter of time before the scientific potential took off. More or less as is the case today in places like Silicon Valley or MIT. In economic jargon, these are what are known as agglomeration economies. In any case, to summarize, we could say that wars and the feeling of threat can be important catalysts for the economic and technological development of a country, in this case the USA, for many reasons. Firstly, because they make it possible to allocate many resources to innovation and to sectors with great potential. Secondly, because they can provide the impetus that many industries need to move forward on their own. And thirdly, because they are capable of creating important agglomerations of companies and talent. However, all of this does not mean that wars are good, obviously. In the end, in the cases that we have explained, the US did not suffer the calamities of a war on its territory. It would be very difficult for Ukraine to replicate the war success that the US did. Similarly, this is not to say that all countries now have to ramp up their public spending on technology. In other words, although public R&D investments can have huge social returns, up to 20% as in the case of the space race, other studies show that returns invested privately by companies can be 2 or 3 times as profitable. Sometimes, governments just need to point them in the right direction. And remember that all public spending involves draining resources from other sectors, so watch out for that. In any case, the good thing about war expenditure is that it is necessary expenditure, and that it is certainly more profitable than other public spending, but nor is it indispensable for technological development. Without going any further, Silicon Valley did not start as a byproduct of government investment. It started thanks to an initiative of Stanford University, which is a private university. So turning to the question of whether the US is so rich because of the threat of wars, well, the answer is probably no. It is certainly possible that all these investments contributed to its development, but they are simply one factor among many in its economic success. Be that as it may, at this point, it's over to all of you. What do you think of the history of NASA and the war investments? Do you think the Yankees did the right thing by these huge investment packages? What other possible benefits do you think wars could have on the economies of the world? What other places could money be best invested to see a best return for society? You can leave your answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. Subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it so we know. All the best. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.